A very good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to our new webinar. My name is Leila Shukroon. I'm Professor of International Law and Director of the University of Portsmouth Democratic Citizenship theme. Today, another fascinating topic we are going to discuss with our colleague from the University, Omid Shams, Iran state media as a weapon of mass suppression. Omid is a PhD candidate at the University of Portsmouth School of Law. He has a bursary. He's a benefactor of the bursary scheme led by the Business School in cooperation with Amnesty International. His current project is on the indirect mechanism of censorship in Iran. He holds a master in American Studies from the University of Turin. He's been working already a lot as a writer and a human rights activist since 2002, actually. And in 2014, after experiencing threats and persecution from the authorities in Iran as a result of his writings and engagement in the human rights activism, he fled his home country for Denmark under the Icons Protection Program for Writers at Risk. And he's an honorary member of Danish PEN. So as I said, it's a really important topic today. And I'm afraid that, in the context of the pandemic, the corona crisis, we've seen a number of countries, it's not limited to Iran, controlling, well, speech, freedom of speech, and applying a number of tools to certainly monitor freedom of speech and writings, and in doing so, impacting and limiting human rights. So again, it's an extremely interesting topic that we're going to address today, which is certainly not limited to one country. And I'm delighted to welcome Omid. So Omid, without further ado, the floor is yours. Omid is going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then we have time for questions and answers. To ask your questions to Omid, kindly use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Omid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leila, for your kind introduction and for inviting me and bringing us together. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to talk about broadcasting false confession and defamatory propaganda program by Iranian state media based on the report which has been recently published. I'm going to mostly give a brief summary of the background and context of this report and the scope of research, and then I'll focus on the main findings of this research. If there's time, I'll try to connect the findings of this research to the topic of my own dissertation, which is indirect censorship. I'll argue that, first of all, the state speaks, and when it speaks from a position of an authoritarian theocratic state, it speaks so loudly and aggressively that it practically destroys the freedom of expression. So here's the report. The title is Orwellian State, Islamic Republic of Iran, State Media as a Weapon of Mass Suppression. It's a collaboration between International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, and Justice for Iran, JFI. I believe that you're all familiar with the FIDH. It's one of the largest human rights organizations, second oldest international human rights organization, and Justice for Iran is also a non-governmental human rights organization devoted to end impunity to human rights violators in Iran. So regarding the background and context, we should know that the practice of broadcasting forced confession in the Islamic Republic of Iran is as old as the regime itself. The earliest instances can be traced back to early 80s with the show trials of the members of Communist Party Sarbedaran, which is also analyzed in this report. But it only recently gained national and even global attention thanks to the social media. And one of the latest, most recent cases that caused public outrage was the case of Ismail Bakhshi and Sepideh Gholian, two prominent labor rights activists who were arrested in 2018. A month later, Ismail Bakhshi was hospitalized due to internal bleeding because of torture. And when they were both released on bail, they immediately issued a statement, revealed that they were severely tortured and forced to confess in front of the camera. So this created a public outrage, and they were shortly after they were arrested again, and their forced confessions were broadcast on IRIB network. It was then when Justice for Iran already has published several reports on occasional cases of forced confession, issued a public call on the victims of forced confessions to step forward and share their stories in order to enable to help the Justice for Iran to advocate for firstly for holding the perpetrators accountable, and secondly to advocate for international policy measures to pressurize Iran in order to stop this practice. This research is a result of that public call, and it has two dimensions. The first is the analysis of the programs broadcast by IRIB between 2009 and 2019. We analyzed more than 150 IRIB programs that contain forced confessions and defamatory programs. And I should note that this number is not the total number of the programs with this kind of contents that have been broadcast. It's just the number of programs that we identified based on the databases that we had access to. The total number might be way more than that. But among these 150 programs, we identified forced confessions of more than 350 individuals were broadcast, and also defamatory content against more than 500 individuals were also broadcast. Here in this part, we were looking into similarity, the patterns in order to find common audiovisual aspects to show whether this practice is a systemic behavior or it's just an occasional misconduct that happens on the part of individuals' misjudgment or misconduct. And then the second part of the research was analysis of the accounts and testimonies of the victims of forced confessions. We interviewed 13 victims of forced confessions, and there also we were looking into similar patterns in terms of the methods of torturing and forcing them to confess, the types of accusations and how these accusations are applied to different groups and activists and people. And I should note that the interviewees also represent a wide and diverse range of victims, from women's rights activists to lawyers, human rights activists, political dissidents, and even families of dual nationals, foreigners, which indicates that how wide the range of potential victims of such programs could be. And by analyzing the content of the programs, we identified three main types of content used to produce these propaganda programs: forced confession, stolen private data, and defamation. So forced confession is usually extracted through a variety of coercive and torture methods. Physical torture is one of the most common methods to obtain forced confessions. In many cases, it's very interesting to know that the physical torture depends mainly on so many different variables: the social status of the detainees, the ethnic or gender identity, the minority status, in a way that, for example, in general, the level of domestic or global attention that this kind of behavior could get for this detainee is very important to understand the way that these detainees are treated. For example, Zanyar and Lughman Moradi, two political prisoners who were arrested and charged with assassination of a Friday Imam's son, and were convicted solely based on their forced confessions and executed eventually. They wrote an open letter to Ahmad Shahid revealing the type of physical torture and psychological torture that they experienced, severe beatings on genitalia and constant floggings, hanging from the roof, and these are the types of physical torture that they experience. It is a very common practice to extract. Also, sleep deprivation and drugging is very commonly used. Several interviewees mentioned that, for example, Maysam Al-Mahdi, a labor rights activist, he says that before his interrogation session begins, he asks for a glass of water. When he drinks it, he immediately feels dizzy and very sleepy, very tired, and Then he goes through a very long, for hours long, interrogation session when he had to write down all of the answers while he couldn't barely keep his eyes open, and he didn't even feel conscious. It was also proved by and mentioned by other interviewees. Hania Farshi, she was arrested in her home in 4 a.m. in the morning, and then were transported into an unknown location. And she was told to sit on a chair for 7 hours without moving, and she was not permitted to lay down or close her eyes. She was constantly checked on to make sure that she's still there. It indicates that there is a pre-planned, deliberate method to push the detainees in order to lose control and to feel unconscious and tired when they go through the interrogation. Threatening detainees' family was frequently mentioned by the interviewees, and it was also considered as one of the most effective ways to force them to confess. For example, Ali Mahdi, again, he says that his interrogators told him that we know that your wife is a terminally ill patient, and we will take him off the list of patients with special needs, which means that she won't receive medicines that her life depends on it. And he was also threatened that we will bring your wife here and undress her in front of everyone. I will torture her in front of you. Ali Mahdi says when it comes to this kind of threats, then you will do anything just to make sure that this won't happen. And the goal for this kind of threats is to make sure that the detainee understand that all the suffering and pain that he experienced will be inflicted on his loved ones and family if he and it will be his fault because he refused to cooperate. It is also very important to know that these threats are not just remain threats. They, in many cases, they are actually carrying out. For example, in some cases, they threatened the detainee that they arrested the family, and they did. So it's not always a threat. And they also mentioned that they had confidence that based on their experience, that the interrogator are able to do whatever they say. The sexual abuse and rape threats and accusation are also very common. There are two reasons for using this kind of methods. First is to portray the detainee as somehow promiscuous and filthy or immoral person, especially targeting women and female detainees because of their vulnerability in terms of the social values and things like that. For example, Sepida Bolian was threatened that her interrogator said that I will tell your family, I know they're a traditional family, I will tell them that you had extramarital relationship and they will kill you. Rape threat and sexual abuse were commonly used. Zanyar Moradi said that his interrogator brought a glass bottle there and said that that you have two choices: to confess in front of camera or sit on this bottle. So these kind of things are very commonly used. And another reason for that is to send a message to the detainee that the interrogator is able to penetrate the deepest, most private parts of their life, to force them to talk about that and to feel that their privacy is violated. Threat of execution is also always there. The detainee are mostly firstly charged with a crime punishable by death, so they live under the constant fear of death and to push them on the verge of breakdown. Using harsh prison conditions is also commonly used. For example, Seper Ibrahimi says that he was punished by sending to a very dangerous, overcrowded ward where they had to sleep next to the toilet, and there was gang war there, and each night someone was stabbed. So he felt under constant fear of death at any time he would be stabbed. And they use this kind of condition to push them to the verge of nervous breakdown. Aside from physical torture, all of these methods are actually used to inflict unbearable psychological pressure. But the main method to do that is solitary confinement. For months, they keep the detainees in solitary confinement. There is no connection to outside world, except when they visit the interrogators. So they will do things to keep the interrogator happy so they can visit him and have this at least a connection to the outside world, which is a very, very unbearable pain for the detainee. And then there's deception when the interrogator tell the detainee that these confessions are only part of paperwork for their release, or they will use that only for internal research and things like that, and they will never be broadcast, which we all know that is a lie. And as of stolen private data, the private data is mostly obtained illegally through illegal search. And what's very important is that when they go and arrest and detainee, they also confiscate all the belongings of any resident that present there, and they use them. In many cases, they don't have actually a case. They arrest the detainee, they confiscate the belongings and use the private data in order to build a case. And in many cases, they show an arrest warrant instead of a search warrant, and do it in a very aggressive and hasty style so the detainee cannot challenge it. Hacking also happens. Rojin Mohammadi, one of the interviews, says that when she was in Philippines, she was in contact with a prominent internet activist, Hossein Ronaqi, and when she was chatting with her, in fact, she was chatting with Ronaqi's interrogator. He was arrested, and they pose as Hossein Ronaqi trying to steal private data. And when he goes back to Iran and gets arrested, he realized that, and she also finds out that they had passwords of all her email account and print of her correspondence. So all of these private data is then eventually used to create or to support the state's narrative, a narrative that has no basis in the facts and truth. It is just used, edited, and misrepresented in a way that it fits into the narrative that the state is trying to establish. For example, husband of Nazanin Zaghari, Radcliffe, he says that use of her personal photos, family photos, her photos with her friends, with European friends, was presented in a way that it would imply that these are the foreign agents that she had contact with, or they use only her photos with no scarf just to imply that she is religiously immoral and she drinks alcohol and things like that. So this is the way that the private data is used. And then we have the defamatory content, defamation. The accusations that is made is basically, there are so many different reasons and goals for that, but basically it's used to spinning the speech. Why? Because the state used this mostly against the targets that the state has no direct influence over them or control over them. They cannot arrest them or assassinate them, suppress them without making a big scandal. So they spin the speech. They create certain accusations to somehow immunize the audience to whatever these individuals have to say. In this way, we should know that these accusations randomly, they are carefully chosen, handpicked, and applied to each individual based on their background, their gender identity, their minority identity. For example, they use sensitivity, the nationalistic sensitivity or religious sensitivity in order to create hatred against this individual. For example, the Arab activists are mostly portrayed as separatists who are Islamic extremists or work in connection with ISIS or the Saudi Arabia, things like that. Kurdish activists are mostly labeled as separatists and terrorists. Women activists are mostly portrayed as promiscuous, immoral, filthy, or agents of the hostile foreign agencies. And then defamation is also used to justify either judicial wrongdoings, judicial suppression, or extrajudicial wrongdoing. We have the case of Qaus Said Emami, prominent environmental activist who was found dead in his cell, and shortly after that, IRIB broadcast some sort of a documentary style program about him misrepresenting his personal photos in order to imply that he was a spy who killed himself to keep his secret. So this is the type of reasons and methods that used for a defamation in order to create some sort of a hostile environment for the activists or to justify wrongdoings. As of the victims, what is very important and interesting is that based on the types of victims that we identified, we can say that technically anyone, any person can be a potential victim for these kind of programs. It's not limited to political dissidents or activists. It's religious minorities, dual nationals, residents foreign countries. They can all be victims. Either they are used to fit within a narrative that the government is trying to establish based on a concept of an independent and revolutionary state that is surrounded by enemies, or they are used to because they are punished because the state wants something from them. For example, professional experts who are not willing to cooperate with military programs of the states. They use this, or the academics, they use these kind of programs to punish them, and mostly also to we have ordinary citizens like a teenage dancer or a social media influencer who were forced to confess in front of camera just to create a narrative and to create chilling effect on the others. As of the perpetrator, the main perpetrator here is the Islamic Republic of Iran's broadcasting network, IRIB, which holds a monopoly over all types of TV and radio broadcasting in Iran. It's the head of IRIB is directly appointed by the Supreme Leader of Iran, and it has no accountability, no duty to respond to any kind of scrutiny or investigation by any elected office in the Islamic Republic of Iran. It has $1 billion official budget, and it also enjoys undeclared financial aid from the Supreme Leader's financial empire. It also enjoys discriminatory privileges over governmental and private advertising, which is a huge help for any media outlet in Iran, and is a very typical example of indirect censorship. Most importantly, the heads of the IRIB most are prominent IRGC or intelligence officials. For example, two former heads of IRIB, Zarqami and Larijani, they were both prominent commanders of Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, which tells us that basically we are not here dealing with some sort of corrupt journalists or simply a dependent media outlet. We are dealing with a media organization run by intelligence and military agents, and it functions as the media organ of these intelligence and military organizations. Then we have Press TV, which is a 24-hour English-French language news network that acts as an international propaganda arm of the IRIB. Is also active right now in Europe. Here in London, they have the office. They are using a legal loophole of broadcasting their programs via internet. Then we have Mardom Khabar, which is IRIB's first internet TV channel, which is mostly targeting the new younger generation using millennial language. In one of their programs that we analyzed, they invited a hacker who claims that he hacked into email accounts of Masih Alinejad, prominent women's rights activist. And in the interview broadcast on national TV, he claims that Masih Alinejad was raped in front of his son by two men while she was on drugs. And these are the kind of accusation things that they are freely made on the national TV. And then we have Ufuk TV, which was initially founded upon the idea of having an exclusive TV channel for IRGC, but it eventually became part of IRIB. And among the policymaker boards, we have two well-known figures or has close ties to IRGC Ghost Force. Nader Talebzadeh, designated by the U.S. Treasury for recruiting American soldiers as a spy for IRGC Ghost Force, and then we have Mohsen Naji. Here is his picture, I think, in Syria that speaks for itself. These are the perpetrators, and as of the goals and impacts, we can say that the main impact of these programs is to create chilling effect, is to demoralize the civil society when they see their prominent figures being forced to confess against themselves, to accept, admit to crimes that they did not commit. This sends a message that the state is trying to tell them that we are able to make anyone to confess to anything that we want, and this creates a very heavy chilling effect on the civil society inside and out Iran and abroad. Spinning the discourse is also one of these goals, to create these labels and cliches around the dissenting discourse in order to neutralize their speech, to immunize the audience to whatever they have to say. Justification of suppression, as I mentioned before, is one of the main goals, and it's also used as evidential basis for convictions. There are many cases when these programs are broadcast, then the people who are in these programs were arrested and charged and convicted based on the accusations made in these programs used as the evidence against them. And they're all also used as a means of emotional pressure to create unbearable pain and psychological pain on the detainees and their families, which in many cases they asserted, the interviewers asserted that the damage and the impact of this emotional pressure is very more damaging than the physical torture that they experienced, and they mostly believe that these kind of accusations will stick. Although most people would say that the state lies and nobody believes that, but the interview said that even though some people would say that this is exaggeration, but they think that parts of it might be true, and this creates a very, very unbearable pressure on the detainees and creates also a heavy chilling effect. And eventually, they're all used as an official to promote the official discourse, both domestically and internationally, to create and to support the narrative that the state is trying to speak. And this leads me to the last part of my talk, which is about the state. So based on what we just said, we can say that the state speaks, and the state speaks through its media organ. And when this media organ enjoys absolute freedom of expression and absolute impunity to accuse people, to defame, to collaborate with the intelligence and military agencies in both obtaining and producing forced confessions and broadcasting them, then we are dealing with a very unique situation where absolute freedom of expression for the state creates absolute no freedom of expression for the society. It totally destroys the freedom of expression in the society. And it's very important to understand that in all of these cases, the state speaks, and the state is also trying to speak through its dissidents. Barth says something very interesting about fascism. It says that fascism does not simply prevent speech, it also compels speech. And that's what we are dealing with here in terms of the Iranian states. It tries to compel the speech, and it tries to speak not only on its own behalf, but also through a dissident. And in this way, it creates some sort of a very complicated and complex mechanism of indirect censorship. So thank you so much for listening and for your patience. I'll now give the floor to Leila. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Omid. That was really important. You know, I usually say that our discussions are fascinating, intellectually stimulating. It is all that, but it is also extremely important to talk about these things. It is disturbing, it is sometimes unbearable to hear the list of tortures and other tools which are used by these type of regimes. And yet again, it's extremely important to remind everybody that human rights is a daily fight, that it's a daily fight everywhere in the world, including in democracies. At the time, the pandemic is often used as an excuse to repress, to suppress human rights and to oppress further again and again populations. So thank you so much, Omid, for this really important discussion on a report that you've been writing together with the International Federation of Human Rights, which obviously has done an immense work together with local partners as in Iran. Well, I do have a number of questions for you, and I'm seeing that we are now receiving questions from the audience. But you know, what struck me really is the sort of similarity of methods, because as I said, you know, in introduction, unfortunately, it's not particularly you know, Iran specific. These methods are used in a number of countries really throughout the world. So can you maybe elaborate further on the sort of conceptual or intellectual premises or background inspiration of this approach?
Yes, that's absolutely true. This is some sort of practice that we can see in several countries. We can see this practice in China very extensively used against the political dissidents and human rights activists. We can see it in Vietnam. Based on the literature of these kind of analyzing forced confession in these countries, we can say that this kind of research has been mostly focused initially on Iran. When, for example, Justice for Iran wrote it's the first report on Press TV, which eventually led to Press TV's Afghan revoking Press TV's license. But then we have, for example, Safeguard Defenders, who have a very good research on the Chinese forced confession. They also created a database for broadcasting forced confessions in China. They are recently published another report on Vietnam. So we can see that these are happening, but mostly what is important to understand is that when these are happening through the media, because media has some sort of protection for based on the freedom press, it is very important to distinguish between the function of media as a media and function of media as a means of suppression, which happens in this kind of because of understanding media has some sort of protection. There were very few measures against this kind of practice happened in the world. So it is important to understand that these kind of practices actually pushes the media out of its original function, and it ceases to be a media anymore. And when we can actually convince the international community that this is what happens, then it paves the way for more serious and more practical international measures in order to stop this sort of practice. But we also have this in some sort of so-called liberal democracies with a lower level of freedoms. We also have this in Russia. We have this in some very rare occasions in Eastern European countries before, but in a way that is used in Iran or China as a systemic, very extensive behavior is just limited to a few countries.
Right. The systematic character, systemic and systematic. And also something I find really interesting is that there is a thin line, like a thin margin between what's authorized and what's not, because Iran is also an extremely creative, artistic country with fantastic movies, fantastic music, and we see on social media, for instance, you know, youngsters creating interesting new movies or songs. And so where is the line really? So that's the arbitrariness, isn't it?
Well, the arbitrariness is the very important part of it. But most importantly, we have to understand that the monopoly over the broadcasting TV and radio programs creates some sort of a media organization that is completely separated from the main body of culture and media in countries like Iran or China. We have prominent writers, filmmakers, and cultural activists who promote these cultures all across the world. But then we have these media organizations that the monopoly over the broadcasting actually create a fine line between them and the body of the society in terms of how they do their media activities. And it's very important to understand that this is the main line here, that these are the only media that enjoy absolute impunity. They can do whatever they want. But on the other hand, if you make a movie with slightest criticism of the government, you are risking confiscation of a movie or facing persecutions and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. We've received a number of questions, Omid. A first question from Olga. I'm interested in public opinion. Are people generally aware of this, and are they critical of what they see on TV, or do they tend to believe it as it has authority?
Absolutely, absolutely. The majority of people, well, as far as they have a voice to express, mostly in the social media, despite the filtering and blocking, they've been vocal about it. They created lots of hashtags, tried to speak up. Mostly, what is very important is that after what happened to Ismail Bakhshi and Sepideh Gholian, so many former political prisoners and former detainees spoke up, and they shared their own experience of torture and being forced to confess. And it is very important for the people. But as much as the people criticize that and somehow try to resist against this kind of thing and to stop it, but it's also important to understand that at some point, when a lie is being repeated over and over, it might be believable. So in many of the testimonies that we analyzed, the interviewees told us that mud sticks. And for example, one of Masih Alinejad, after the national TV in Iran made this announced this fake news, totally baseless claim that she was raped in front of her son. She said that some of her friends called her and said, "What happened? I know that we thought that they might be exaggerating, but there has to be something there. Something might have happened." This is the most dangerous thing. The most dangerous thing for the activists and political activists, dissidents, because they eventually cannot shake it off forever, because there are some parts of it that sticks with them. For example, when they link them to intelligence agencies around the world, they never, for example, come and say that, okay, this activist is linked to Swedish intelligence agency. They will say that he is working with Saudi Arabia, because they are trying to use some sort of nationalistic sensitivities or historical background that create hatred or has this potential to create hatred against these people. And the way that they are choosing specifically each label for each activist is very, very worrying.
Thank you very much, Omid. We have a question which relates to the international reaction, really, from Michael. What kind of pressures, actions can the international community employ, knowing that in the recent past, we all remember what has happened, some progresses were made, and eventually we went back to some, past situation with embargoes, etc. Can you maybe explain that for us, Omid?
That's good. Thank you, Michael, for that. But, look, let me give you two examples of how international reactions are affected by the political events and their political agendas. For example, let's take a look at the U.S. policy, for example. U.S. policy is now focused on the maximum pressure in Iran, which is mainly focused on the economic pressure. And they are very apparently vocal about the human rights violations in Iran. But when it comes to the policy, what you see is almost inaction. For example, during the Obama's administration, there was an agreement with Iran, some sort of general understanding with Iran that exempts IRIB from U.S. sanctions and restrictive measures, which is based on Iran's promise not to send satellite jamming, which actually not only block the programs inside the territory of Iran, but also interfere with the functions of these satellites, which is an international offense. Actually, it's against the international law. So they suspended these sanctions which were initially made to punish the government for human rights violation, but then they stopped sending jamming signals to the satellite, but they are now using terrestrial jamming, which creates which is very dangerous for the citizens inside Iran, and this creates a very, very problematic situation, because now one of the main perpetrator in human rights violations, which deals with torture in Iran, is now exempt from this. On the other hand, we have the EU, where they are trying so hard to maintain, to preserve the JCPOA with Iran, which is not this joint comprehensive plan is not that comprehensive enough to include human rights violations on the part of Iranian state. For example, 2 heads of IRIB were put on the list of restrictive measures of the EU into like 5 years ago, if I'm not wrong, around 2013 to 2015. But then they were changed and nothing happened then. And since then, this kind of human rights violation regarding the IRIB increased, but you don't see any more names added to the list. You don't see IRIB to be added to the list. So these are all together create a very, very complicated situation. What can happen is, for example, Magnitsky Act can be really helpful here for first of all to enable the victims to demand justice for this kind of human rights violation. And on the other hand, what is very, very crucial if this happens is to recognize the broadcast of forced confession as a form of torture. If that happens, it paves the way for a variety of international measures to be taken.
That's really interesting, Omid, because this is also where, for us as international lawyers, somehow disciplines meet, because the impact of sanctions and embargoes have never worked. I mean, it's never worked for human rights at all. And also there's a level of hypocrisy when you know that there are international relations, there is international cooperation, there is even something which is functioning very well between the US and Iran. That's the US-Iran International Claims Tribunal. It's in place for about almost 40 years now, I suppose, and it's produced fantastic jurisprudence and it's working perfectly. So that's complex and indeed involves a number of things. You have another question from Panos. Right. Thanks, Omid, for a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering whether and to what extent it would be preferable to frame the issue of forced confessions as one of torture or inhuman or degrading treatment rather than one of freedom of expression. You've already started to respond to that. I'm asking, as there is arguably a significant difference between how the international community views this violation of an absolute right and are viewed by the international community and litigated before international human rights organs compared to how it views violation of freedom of expression.
Yeah, thank you, Panos. Yeah, that's a brilliant question, because what we are dealing with here, and I think it's actually a very normal procedure in the international courts. Then when you have an absolute right violated, when you have the most serious rights violated, then the focus is mainly on that. And when it comes to absolute rights, such right to freedom from torture, if this happens, if we recognize broadcasting forced confession as a form of torture, or at least inhuman or degrading treatment, which is quite debatable, because, and we can actually argue that, because we have a constant fear, we have humiliation there, we have a very a type of permanent stigma there. So if we can prove that there is that this kind of practice reaches that threshold of right to freedom from torture, then we can also argue that there is a universal jurisdiction for actually dealing with these kind of violations. And most importantly, when it comes to broadcasting this kind of content as a form of torture, this can actually help the human rights activists and organizations, and also the victims, to make claims against the IRIB's staff who are actually working right now in Europe, in the liberal democracies, and they are literally collecting informations and private data. They can actually make a surveillance on the citizens or dual nationals in these countries, as we have so many different cases where the European states found out that some proxies of Iran were actually spying on the dissidents in Iran abroad. So this can actually make ways for us to say that, okay, this is not simply a matter of freedom of expression. This is a matter of torture, and it's also a matter of right to life, because these forced confessions are in so many cases used as evidential basis for conviction, and that conviction led to execution. Right now, these 3 young men who are waiting for the execution, they are actually convicted based on their forced confessions, nothing else. So this is a very, very serious crime that's happening. So if we can convince the international community that about the gravity of this violation, then there will be I think I'll be optimistic that there will be a big change.
Mm-hmm. Very important again. Thank you so much, Omid. You have another question from Iris. I'm interested in what the objective evidence says about the government of Iran's ability to silence or persecute Iranian artists or journalists abroad. Is there any evidence of Iran having links or spies abroad? Thank you.
Well, I think a few months ago, Sunday Times published an article about some of the protesters in Scotland, Iranian protesters in Scotland, who were threatened at gunpoint or threatened by people by some people through phone calls and things like that for their participation in demonstration in Scotland. I can find the article and send it to you. But another issue here is that this kind of silencing, this kind of suppression, the general function of indirect censorship is to impose self-censorship.
Yes.
And self-censorship is very, very difficult to track down, unless the one who self-censors speak up and says that I avoid talking about this topic because of this and this and these consequences. And that's why indirect censorship is now increasingly used in Iran. Although the Iranian government is so free to use all types of direct censorship, they're using that because it leaves no trace, because it is very difficult to actually document how certain act of the government led to certain kind of self-censorship or silencing. It is very difficult to trace it down, but we can say at least that, for example, let me give you an example of Masih Ali-Nejad. Masih Ali-Nejad's family were forced to give interviews in national TV about these issues, about her, Masih Alinejad, and then her father was forced to call her and say, "I will disown you. I will disown you if you keep interviewing these victims. If you keep doing what you're doing." It happened during the after.
I think you might be muted, Omid. Omid, if you hear me, can we?
We seem to have lost Omid.
Yeah, Omid, if you hear me, can you just stop for a while because you're muted apparently? Omid, you're muted. Can you kindly unmute yourself because we've lost you? You can't hear me. All right, apologies everyone, we have a technical issue apparently. So you
I think it must be the internet.
Interesting. Omid, you seem to be muted. So maybe one way to do that is that you just go and come back if you hear me. Oh, I hear you typing. Oh, you can't hear me.
I've just typed it up in the message to Omid.
All right, sorry everyone, but we're trying to deal with that and come back to you because we have more questions. So Hamid, why don't you try to just, leave the meeting and come back. Okay, so maybe Omid is going to try to do that. Right, so sorry everyone, but I'm sure we're going to manage to address this question and further our discussion for at least 5 to 10 minutes. All right, so Omid is gone and is going to come back. Maybe a few sort of reminders. You know that our webinars are available online on the banner of Research Futures. You can find many of them. We've discussed a number of fascinating issues for those of you who are new to these webinars, not necessarily related to international law or human rights, but really a very wide, range of topics in all sort of disciplines. We've discussed the idea of slowing down recently. We've discussed the idea of Black Lives Matters. We've discussed physics, biology, all sorts of topics. I see that Olga has just sent you a link to the Research Futures portal on the website. So everything is there. So if you want to see these webinars again, if you want to approach me with webinars ideas or topics, feel free as well. So I hope Omid is able to come back. Is he here? Omid, are you around? Don't yet see him. Right.
Work. He's currently doing his PhD with us in the School of Law, as you have already said in your introduction. He's actually working on indirect censorship, indirect mechanisms of censorship. And I think that this is particularly crucial for our discussion today, because one of the most interesting aspects of Omid's research on indirect censorship relates to how some of the techniques used openly and often by more, let's say, authoritarian regimes, are in fact techniques replicated that in Western liberal democracies, perhaps in more covert ways. And one of the core obstacles that Omid has faced, or the core challenges that he has faced early on when he started researching indirect censorship, was the notion of distinguishing between different forms of censorship in the first place. So he was very keen on researching indirect censorship in particular, and I'm sure that when he joins us, he can speak more eloquently to the reasons why this became the topic of his PhD research. But I think that early on, he discovered, and I did with him, that it is not very easy to draw a line between what counts as direct censorship and what counts as indirect censorship. And I think that the produced, he co-authored, is in fact the case in point. As a lawyer myself, and I'm not sure if you would agree, I'm not entirely convinced how easy it would be to prove before a court of law that a confession is indeed a forced confession. And I think this is perhaps the reason why this is framed at the first instance as a freedom of expression issue rather than as a torture or inhuman or degrading treatment issue.
Right. Thank you so much, Panos. I think it's really important what you said. We had a discussion here. We had a webinar on data protection and privacy. And absolutely, I was alluding to that at the beginning of the seminar. These techniques are not used only by authoritarian regimes. They are emulated by liberal democracies to maybe a lesser extent, slightly differently. But we know that the Orwellian State, Omid, metaphor. Yes. Oh, you're back, Omid.
Yes, sorry about that. I don't know, for a very strange reason, all my sound on my laptop is just, I don't know, just locked. So I had to connect with my phone, sorry.
All right, we'll try not to draw conclusions. Okay, so you were explaining something and you have another question. So would you like to go back to what you were saying?
Sure, yeah. I was saying that for example, I was trying to give you an example on how this happened. For example, for one of the women rights activists, the state forced her father to call her and ask her to stop interviewing the families of the victims in Iran, to actually to stop interviewing them, and he threatened her daughter that I will disown you if you continue to do that. So this is an unbearable pressure imposed on a human rights activist to live abroad, a continent away from Iranian states. And so if the state can do that, and if that has a very effective pressure on the activists and dissidents abroad, this means that the state is actually able to use these kind of programs and to use the families or the suffering of their families to put pressure on the activists abroad.
Of course. So that's again something really important to bear in mind. You have another question from Kemia. Iranian regime propaganda machines knows how folk looks to their output, but why they are going to use more and more this type of cold TV interviews. Latest one is the case of Rohala Zam. Maybe you can explain that further. What's this case about?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, Leila, I had some lags when you were asking the question. Can you repeat the first part of the question? I didn't get it.
Surely. The first part of the question: the Iranian regime propaganda machine knows how folk looks to their output, but why are they going to use more and more this type of cold TV interviews? So why this type of interviews? And then this person alludes to the case of Ruhollah Zam that you might need to explain to us.
Sure. Well, Ruhollah Zam was the head of a Telegram channel on mostly political issues in Iran. His channel had more than 2 million followers and subscribers in Iran. It was a very, very popular channel, although he wasn't actually following, you know, the rules of journalism. There were so many controversial news on his channel. But anyway, he was eventually kidnapped by the IRGC intelligence organizations in Najaf and was transferred to Iran, where he was tried and convicted and sentenced to death. He's now waiting for execution. He was his forced confessions were occasionally broadcast. First, when he was arrested, there was a very short video of him admitting to his mistakes and things like that. And then there was a very, very controversial so-called interview with one of the IRIB's senior presenters, who is known for his collaboration with the IRGC Ghost Force and IRGC intelligence organization. He is a very well-known figure for actually involving in all types of interrogation. He was also identified by some of the victims of forced confession as a person who was there when the interrogators were interrogating the detainee. And trying to, he was also, it was alleged to write down the questions and answers for the detainees. So this is how this happens. The Iranian government uses these kind of programs for both domestic and international purposes. Domestic purposes, part of these domestic purposes is to convince its own supporters that as I said, that this suppression, this brutal crackdown, that also is questioned by their own supporters, has some legitimacy in it. For example, by linking the protesters to intelligence services, or linking the prominent journalists and dissidents to foreign countries, they're trying to say that, okay, there is a plan against us, and these are not ordinary journalists, these are not ordinary people who protested, these are trained terrorists who went to other countries, and the way that these accusations are made are completely baseless. I mean, in some cases they try to, for example, convince a person that he went to Israel and trained while he has never left the country ever. And then we have the case of, for example, these detainees who were forced to confess that they were involved in assassination of the Iran's nuclear scientist, which is it's a very important case because it's one of the few cases that the state itself admitted that it was completely fake, it was completely fabricated, just to put the pressure off the back of the intelligence organization in Iran. They arrested 18 people and tortured them, forced them to confess and admit that they assassinated the nuclear scientists in Iran. This is how it works. So the continuing this is also some sort of a resisting and bullying, resisting against the international pressure and bullying the dissidents abroad, and also to convince parts of their supporters inside that that might actually believe this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much, Omid. I think we have to bring this conversation to a close, at least for now. I would like to thank you very much again for this really important presentation. It takes a lot of courage to write this type of report, really. It's not, you know, an average research publication. I know your report is public. It's available online. I believe you can find it under the website or on the website of the FIDH to start with. It's a very important report. As you understood, it speaks about Iran, but also a number of other authoritarian regimes, and to some extent as well our liberal democracies. So thank you so much, Omid, for this presentation. I would like
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening.
Most welcome.